Hi, I'm Radine. Today we're going to be looking at life sciences, and we're going to be looking at the topic of evolution. Evolution can sometimes be a controversial topic, and today we're going to unpack a few of the concepts, so hopefully it becomes a bit clearer. All right, have you ever thought about where life comes from? If you have a look, you can see that from the smallest organism, from the simplest organism is where life originated, to what we see today with all the different varieties of living organisms that we find on Earth. Okay. All right, we're going to have a look at the concepts that we're going to cover today in the introduction to evolution. First of all, we'll have a look at a definition of what evolution is. And then we're going to have a look at the concepts of a hypothesis and a theory. And there we're going to also have a look at the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. We're going to also look at evolution evidence. So there's lots of evidence that we have that supports the theory of evolution. And then we're going to look at, finally, we're going to have a look at the sources of genetic variation. All right, so let's have a look at some key words. Because what's very important in life sciences is that we understand the terminology. If we understand the terminology, it makes the topic and the subject so much easier. So first of all, we're going to have a look at what we call biological evolution, because we are talking about living organisms. And basically what evolution or biological evolution is where we see genetic changes that take place in a population, and those are then inherited over several generations, and they then eventually become changes that then become fixed in a population. Okay, the next key word that we're going to look at is hypothesis. Now, you might have come across hypothesis before. We've done scientific method, and we know that a hypothesis is usually an educated guess or explanation as to what you think is going to happen or why a certain phenomena happen. Okay, so basically here we're looking at the hypothesis as a proposed explanation for a phenomenon that may occur. Right, then we're going to have a look at the word or the term theory. And a theory is a well-substantiated explanation of an aspect of the natural world that can be incorporated, that can incorporate laws, hypotheses, and facts. Okay, so a theory isn't just something that somebody thought about and said, okay, I have a theory. In a scientific theory, what we've actually got is we have laws, hypotheses, and facts that actually back up that theory. All right, and then another key word that we need to have a look at today is biogeography. And if we break this word up into two parts, we can see the first part is bio, which means living, and then geography, the second part, means, you know, the earth or part of the earth. So basically what we have a look here at when we're looking at this term, we look at the distribution of species and ecosystems in geographic space and through geographical time. So in other words, we have a look at how the continents were arranged at various times and why organisms might be similar. If we have a look today, why we find organisms that are similar but are actually thousands of kilometers apart. All right, and then the next keyword we're going to have a look at is homologous structures. Now again, when we do terminology, it's always a good idea to break up the word into what you can, and then you can work out the parts. So if you break it up into smaller parts, it makes it a lot easier to figure out. So homo means the same, okay, and then logos, so what we're looking at is structures in organisms that are the same or similar. Okay, so homologous means similar structures. So if we have a look at certain organisms, we might find organs or we might find bones that have similar underlying anatomical features that are found in these different animals. So although they are, you know, on the outside look different, there might be something inside their bodies that is common. Okay, we're going to take a short break now, so we'll see you after the break. Welcome back from the break. I hope you had a chance to stretch your legs and maybe get something to drink, but let's carry on with the lesson. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now is specifically the definition. We're going to have a look at the definition of evolution. So we're going to have a look at some examples where we see how evolution actually takes place. And then we're going to have a look at a hypothesis, and we're going to see what a hypothesis is, even look at an example, and then we're going to have a look at the theory, or a theory, and an example of a theory, and then we're going to have a look at what the difference between the two is. Okay, so that we are able to understand those two concepts well. All right, so let's have a look at what is evolution. Okay, now I'm going to start at the diagram first, and we're going to have a look at this this is evidence of whale evolution. And the reason why we have such a comprehensive record of whale evolution is because if you remember when you studied the formation of fossils and how fossils are formed, it's very important that when the organism dies, it falls into usually in a body of water where it can be covered by sediment quite quickly. Okay, and this is why we have such a nice clear record of what whale evolution or how whale evolution took place. So if we have a look right at the top here, we can see this is a four-legged organism or animal, and if we look at the next one even, we can see that they've got four legs and they look like land mammals. Okay, and in fact, it was very similar to a dog-like organism that lived on land. And obviously the environmental conditions changed and they needed to adapt to a more watery or a more aquatic environment. So as you can see here in the next organism, you can already see there's a change in the body shape. So the body is becoming a little bit more elongated. The limbs, you can see the positioning of the limbs has changed so that they are more adept at swimming possibly in the water. Remember, they need to now survive in water. They need to go and find food. They need to go or get away from predators. And as time goes on, and this takes place over millions of years, here you can see the body. You can even see the tail is adapting. It's changing. And the limbs start looking more like paddles, okay, which makes it more, or makes it a lot easier to swim, and so it can swim faster. And all of this you can see now, even the structure's changing, and these changes take place through mutations. So when mutations occur and that mutation happens to make the organism more suited to the environment that it finds itself in, then that would be selected to survive. So that organism will survive. And when it survives, it's able to then reproduce, and what it does is then it passes on its genes of that mutation or changed characteristic. And so you can see that as we go along here, already at this stage, the tail has now developed. It's become way more, it's much longer, okay, and so usually they use that as a propeller or as a stabilizer in the water. And even we can't see anymore, we don't see any evidence of hind limbs anymore. So they have actually changed completely. All right, and here we only see the evidence of the front limbs. All right, and then when we look at the next one, we can see that the body has now become more elongated and the tail is becoming a little bit stronger, and so that it's actually a little bit closer to what we know. And the last diagram over here, we see this is the whale as we know it today. Okay, so this it doesn't take place in a couple of years, it takes place over a very long period of time, but we do have evidence of this evolution, and we can see really nicely how it does take place. Okay, so let's have a look at the concept, and basically what evolution is it's processes that take place. And during those processes, as I said, we have genetic mutations that occur, and they then change, or they transformed life from what it was in its earliest forms. So if we have a look here, this earliest form, if we have a look at the earliest forms and compare it to what it is today, we see it's totally transformed completely. All right, so, and what has happened is, from those earliest forms, life has now been transformed to the diversity. And you know, diversity is when we talk about lots of different organisms or lots of differences. So there's quite a vast diversity that we see that characterizes life on Earth today. Okay, so from what it was originally to what it is now, it's a totally different organism. Okay, and as I said when we were going through this, is that it would be mutations that take place. And you know, mutations, we've already learned that they're random, they occur randomly, and they then would work either in favor of an organism or maybe against the organism, but that is how the organisms change. So what we see in the transformation is very important, is a change in the genes. Okay, we're going to have a look at what we now call biological evidence. And as I said earlier, bio means living, so we're looking at the evolution of living organisms. And if we have a look at the diagram here, this again is a good example. We see evidence of how the modern day horse that we know, how it has evolved. So if we have a look, that this modern day horse is related, okay, and it came from this organism here at the beginning. So in other words, it has descended from this organism and is related to all of those that have lived in the past. Okay, and as you can see through the diagram here, there are changes. So if we have a look at the modern horse over here, and we can see how it is different to its earliest ancestor over here. So even though that might not look the same, it is related, and it has evolved through the ages and slightly changed, or it's changed over time to what we know it as today. So if we have a look at the actual definition, it basically means that all present day forms, so everything that we see on the earth today, so all the living organisms, all the plants, all the animals, all the unicellular and multicellular organisms, if we have a look, we see they have descended from, so in other words, they've come from something in the past, and they are related to, because they have descended from those organisms. So all of those that lived in the past. They may look different, and we can see that here. So if we have a look at the first horse, and we look at what we know today as the horse, we can see they look different. Okay, and that is because they became modified. Right, and that modification took place in the form of mutation. So it was the genes that were modified. And because of that modification, they then look different from one generation to another. Okay. All right, now we're going to have a look at the concept of a hypothesis. And we're going to see the definition of a hypothesis, and it's important that we know the definition, and we know it as a testable statement. So in other words, when we formulate a hypothesis, it must be testable, so we must be able to test it. And basically, it would be a testable statement about the natural world. Okay, because we're working in life sciences, it is always about the natural world, and it can be used, so we can use hypotheses to build more complex. Okay, so we want more complex inferences or explanations of why certain things happen as they do or why things are as they are. And let's have a look at an example here. Okay, so we can say, or we might say, the high incidence. So in other words, there's a lot of people that are infected with HIV. Okay, so the high incidence of HIV and AIDS in the world may be due to a lack of education. Okay, so we're saying that, we're making a statement. We're saying that due to a lack of education, a lot of people don't know about the causes of the disease, and therefore there is so much HIV and AIDS in the world today. That is a statement that we can't make, and we can't say, yes, that is a fact. We actually need to test it. Okay, and that's why we always say that a hypothesis is a testable statement. So I now need to go and see that if this is the case, is the fact that there's so much HIV in the world, is it due to the fact that very many people don't know what causes the disease and possibly how it is spread and things like that. So it's a statement that I can now go and test. All right. And right, now what is a theory? So we're going to have a look at the definition of a theory. And basically what a theory is it's a well-substantiated explanation. So well-substantiated means there's lots of facts, there's lots of information that backs up that statement or that explanation. So it's not just something that somebody's just thought about out of their head and decided that this is a theory. Okay, so it is well substantiated. So there's lots of backup evidence for that explanation. And again, it's some aspect of the natural world, because we work in the natural world, and it can incorporate, as I said, there's facts, there's laws, there's inferences, and there's tested hypotheses that are all the information that substantiates that explanation. All right, so let's have a look at an example. If we look at this example, we know, or we say, and we accept it, that this is fact, that the sun is the center of the universe. Okay, so everything revolves around the sun. Okay, so all the planets, okay, including Earth, then would revolve around the sun. We don't question it, we accept it as a theory. It's known as the heliocentric theory. Helio means sun, and centric obviously means the middle. And this is an accepted because it's an explanation that is accepted because it has facts, it has laws, it has inferences, and it has tested hypotheses that back it up. All right, the theory of evolution. So it's not just a story that somebody's thought about and, has tried to tell a story. It is actually a theory, a scientific theory that has been developed. So it's definitely not just a story. It's been developed over many years by many different scientists. So there's lots of scientists that have worked on it, and it is regarded as a scientific theory, which is very important, because there are hypotheses that are related to evolution that have been tested and have been verified over time. So let's have a look at the diagram here. This is a nice diagram of evolution, or of evolutionary relationships between organisms. And if we have a look at the base of the tree here, we see a very simple unicellular organism at the base. As we go up the tree, we can see the next level is slightly more complex than that unicell. So here we see it looks like ferns, and this would be mosses. And you have learned these plants, and you know that they're not as complex. And here we see another unicellular organism. Okay, and as we go up the tree, we see there's a branch, and these are our gymnosperms. And we go higher up the branch, and here we have our angiosperms. And each branch, as we go up, we see the organisms becoming more complex until we find those organisms that we know today. And if you have a look, so here we have plants, and here we have insects, and arthropods and those kind of organisms. Here we have, on this branch, we see our organisms, amphibians, and then we go to mammals, which we know as the top of our kingdoms, all right, of all the organisms. So there you can see how evolution has been developed, or the theory of evolution has been developed, looking at the complex, or the more complex nature of life as it evolves till we reach the top. Okay, so I hope you guys are understanding the difference and you understand what evolution is. And so just to summarize quickly, we want to say that the theory of evolution is a scientific theory because it has been developed over time using evidence, using hypotheses that have been tested, using facts, using laws, and it has been tested, so it is supported by all of this evidence, and we can see that therefore we say that evolution is a theory, a scientific theory. Welcome back from the ad break. Let's carry on with our lesson. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is we're going to have a look at the evidence that there is for evolution. Okay, so we're going to now look at the various forms that we have. And if we have a look here, the first thing we're going to have a look at is the fossil record. And remember, you have covered and you did learn how fossils were formed. And what we do is we go and have a look, and we find that fossils are found in different layers of rock. Okay, so and if you remember, we have stratified rock, so it means that there are various layers, and obviously the oldest, so we might find a fossil here, some kind of fossil organism, and then we'd find something else here, and something else here. So we find various fossils in the various layers. And remember, because what happens when fossils are formed, there's layers of sand or sediment that are deposited on top of the organism's body. So then this layer here would obviously be the oldest. Whereas this one over here would be the youngest. Okay, and then so as we go deeper down, and the deeper we go, the older the fossils we find in the deeper layers. Okay, and that's how then we would date them and then determine how old they actually are. All right, so it's different fossils that are found in different rock layers. Okay, that's the fossil record. And we said the oldest fossils usually are in the oldest or the lowest or further down down in the earth. Those are the oldest rock layers, and therefore we usually say that those fossils then are older than the ones that we would find. And very often we also find transitional fossils. So we might find that between these fossils and these fossils in this layer, there was another layer of fossils that are transitional. So those transitional fossils, they would have some characteristics that are common with the fossils found in the oldest layer, as well as other characteristics that may be common with fossils that are found in a later layer. All right, so that is the fossil record. Here we see a diagram. We see where an excavation where a fossil is emerging out of the rock layer, and it actually becomes quite an intense and quite a complicated process to actually get the fossil out of the rock, because you don't want to damage the bones. And remember, it's just the bones usually that have become fossilized, and so when archaeologists work on the fossil record, they work very carefully and with very fine tools to actually then let the fossil emerge out of the rock. Because remember, it is in rock, it's not in soil. These have then been fossilized in rock, so it becomes quite difficult. All right, so the fossil record shows us, this is what it does show us. It shows a systematic change. As I said on the previous slide where I showed you the different layers of fossils, it's a systematic change that has taken place through time. Okay, so it didn't just happen. It can take up to 10,000 years before the earliest that something starts to become fossilized is about 10,000 years. And so it's a systematic change that has taken place through time and is termed descent, which we said is when you descend from something else with modification. Okay, so when we look at the fossil record, we can see there are changes in the body structure of organisms. And that modification we mentioned earlier, we said, was due to genetic changes. All right, then the evidence, what the evidence does show us, it shows characteristics, okay, that make organisms similar to one another. And that is where we spoke about the transitional fossil. So we can have a look at various layers of fossils through the time periods, and we can see, did a layer above a lower layer, did those organisms evolve from? Did they descend, or were they descendants of the fossils that were in the layer below that? All right, and that's all of that information we can then gather from the study of fossils. So they are a very important part of our record of evolution as it has taken place. All right, so we're going to have a look at another form of evidence called biogeography. And earlier when we were talking about the term, we said we're looking at living organisms, which is bio, and geography is where they are in the world. All right, so biogeography then is the study of where species, so it's the study of where species are found and why they are found there. All right, so if we have a look, there's many plants and animals that we have a look at in the world, in regions that are similar. Okay, so of the same line of latitude, similar climates and conditions, and that then suggests that possibly these organisms share a common ancestor. All right, so let's have a look at the diagram over here, and in fact on the next slide we've got it a little bit larger. And this is one example of our large, basically flightless birds that you can see on different continents. Okay, so we are very familiar with the ostrich. We find that in South Africa. There's the cassowary, which we find in Papua New Guinea. The kiwi, which the New Zealanders are known for, is their kiwi. We call them kiwis. In Australia, we find the emu. And in South America, we find the rhea. Now, if we have a look at all of these birds, we can see that there are similarities. You know, they have some characteristics in common. However, they are found in regions that have huge distances between them. The rhea is found in South America, the ostrich in Africa, the emu in Australia, the kiwi in New Zealand, and the cassowary is in Papua New Guinea. And what we know about these birds is that they're flightless. So they couldn't have flown these distances to the different regions that we find them in today. So when we have a look at this, we see that there are characteristics in common. So we assume that they have come from a common ancestor, which then means that they must have emerged or evolved from that common ancestor in a particular region. So this then gives us an idea that perhaps these continents before were joined. So before we have the continents as we know them today, before continental drift took place, these organisms then may have all come or all been in a common region from a common ancestor, and as continental drift occurred, so the continents then moved away, and this is why we see that they are not all exactly the same. They are different species, but they have characteristics that are common. Okay, so that's what biogeography tells us about, gives us information on evolution. All right, then the next concept we're going to have a look at, the next form of evidence, is what we call genetics, and genetics is very important. And genetics, basically, we have a look to see how closely related organisms are. So the more genetics or genes that they have in common, or that they have the same, the closer the relationship. Okay, so that's species that are closely related. They have greater genetic similarity to each other than organisms that are not as close, so to more distant species. And therefore, they would then share a more common ancestor. Okay, so let's have a look at the diagram. One of the forms of genetics that we use, we call it mitochondrial DNA, and we know, or we've learned, that mitochondrial DNA usually is passed on by the mother. Okay, so in this little diagram here, in the first generation, we see there's the mother, and she's passed on her mitochondrial DNA to her son and her daughter. Neither of them inherited any mitochondrial DNA from the father. Okay, and if we have a look then, we can see, now you see this son over here has his mother's mitochondrial DNA, but remember his offspring are going to get their DNA from their mother, the mitochondrial DNA. So we look through the maternal lineage, but here we can trace the maternal mitochondrial DNA of these offspring. They come, and we can trace it all the way back to the grandmother. Okay, so that's how we have a look, and we can see the more genetic similarities there are between organisms, the more closely they are related. All right, and then the next form of evidence that we have a look at is homologous structures, and as I said previously, homo means the same, so then they have similarities in the structures. So there are structures that are similar. So if we have a look at this diagram, here we can see this is a fin or a flipper of a whale. This is a bird, the wing of a bird, a dog, and a human. Okay, now if we have a look at the bone structure, okay, this is known as the pentadactyl limb, and if we have a look specifically, we can see the different parts, and what they've done is they've colored the parts the same. So here you can see, so these are bones, even though they have a slightly different shape, they are the same bone. All right, and here you can see it's color coding all the way. You can see all the common the bones that are same, but obviously they are different depending on the organism. All right, so basically here we have a look at, so what we can say from this is that even though all of these organisms are different, we've got a whale that lives in water, we've got a bird that lives in the air, and we have a dog that is a quadrupedal, it walks on all fours, and then we have a human, this is a human hand. So it seems that all these organisms are very different, but what it actually shows us is that more than likely all of these organisms share a common ancestor. And we would trace back to see how much of the genetics is in common to show how closely related they are. Okay, we're going to end it here. We're going to take a short break. We'll see you back after the break. Welcome back from our break, and let's carry on with the lesson. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at the sources of genetic variation. All right, so we have a look, we spoke about genetic evidence, and now we look at the genetic evidence and where variation comes from. All right, so the study of genetics deals with similarities and differences of related organisms. Okay, so we will find that there are some characteristics that are similar, but then there are obviously also those characteristics that are different. Okay, genetic evidence that organisms are closely related and are likely to have in common or have a common ancestor includes identical DNA structure, a similar sequence of the genes. So in other words, the order in which their genes are found, that would be similar. Similar portions of DNA with no function. So in other words, that junk DNA that we learnt about when we studied DNA, that doesn't actually code for a gene. So that would be, those portions of DNA would also then be similar. And then similar mutations. And particularly we look at mitochondrial DNA because it's very, very easy to see the mutations occur in mitochondrial DNA a lot quicker, and it's quite easy to see them. All right, so now let's see, where does genetic variation come from? And all of these sources of variation you have actually studied earlier on in the year. Okay, so the different sources of genetic variation are the following. The first one is crossing over. And crossing over, we know, takes place during prophase 1. And only during prophase 1. So what happens here is your homologous chromosomes lie together next to each other, and then chromatids, non-sister chromatids, would cross over and they would exchange genetic material. So as soon as those chromosomes move apart, they already are not the same as they were when they started out. There's already genetic variation. So we've created genetic variation in crossing over. All right, then the second place where genetic variation would occur is when the chromosomes go and line up on the equator during metaphase. And in this phase of meiosis, they go and line up at the equator randomly. So in other words, there isn't a set pattern that they line up on. We don't have to have all the maternal chromosomes on one side and the paternal on the other. It's just random. And every single time that meiosis takes place, those chromosomes would randomly line up. So there's never ever the same sequence. And that also then creates genetic variation. All right, then we look at the next one, the next source of genetic variation, which is random fertilization. And that is when we have, when a cell undergoes meiosis, it's going to form 4 gametes. So any one of those 4 gametes can fertilize another gamete. So if this is sperm cells, any one of those 4 would then have the chance of fertilizing the ovum. So that is why we say we don't know which one. Okay, and remember there are thousands and thousands and thousands of sperm cells that are produced. So that is why we say that fertilization is random. And because of that randomness, it brings about genetic variation. Okay, the next source of genetic variation is random mating. So if we have a look in organisms in the natural world, not all organisms have partners that mate for life. Most organisms don't. And even if we have a look in the plant world, mating is random. So there isn't always the same mate. The mating partner is not always the same. And this then, because it's random, then also introduces genetic variation. All right, and then the last form, or the last source of genetic variation is mutations. And remember we said that we learned that mutations are a random change in the genetic structure of an organism. So again, we don't know what causes it, why it happens, when it happens. It just does happen. And it happens randomly. And because of that, the randomness of the mutations then also creates a source for genetic variation. So all of those then are the sources of genetic variation. Okay. Now we get different types of variation. If we have a look at characteristics, there are some characteristics that don't place individuals or organisms into specific categories. And they seem to have more a continuous variation between the different forms of in the variation. And that we then call continuous variation. Okay, and a very good example of this is when we have a look, and here's a diagram that shows you skin color. You can see of all these little girls, they all have various ranges. There's a whole range of skin color, hair color, eye color, even their height. Okay, so a very good example of a characteristic that has continuous variation is height. And if we have a look at the definition of continuous variation, then it's those characteristics where there is a range of intermediate phenotypes. So in other words, we don't just see short and tall. We see some short and then some a little bit taller and then some a little bit taller than that and middle height and then some very tall. So there isn't just two categories or three categories, short, medium and tall. Okay, there is a variation between all of them. So there's a range of intermediate phenotypes. And remember, phenotype is our physical appearance. Okay, another type of variation is called discontinuous variation. And as soon as we see this first part, discontinuous, that means that it doesn't flow. There is no continuation. So that then gives us a hint as to what this type of variation is. And if we have a look at the definition, we see it's those characteristics that fall into distinct categories. So discontinuous variation is all those characteristics that we find that then make us specifically into different categories. And a very good example of that in humans is blood groups. So if we have a look at the diagram, we can see that we have 4 different blood groups. So we've got 4 blood groups here. We've got blood group A, blood group B, blood group AB, and blood group O. And so even though it's the same characteristic, it's blood, there is no continuous variation. You either have blood group A, or you have blood group B, or you have blood group AB, or you have blood group O. All right, so let's go back and have a look just to make sure the difference between continuous variation and discontinuous variation. Okay, so continuous variation, we said, is those characteristics where there's a range of intermediate phenotypes. So there's a continuation. All right, so if you have a look at height here, you can see these girls. Some of them are very short, and then there's one that might be a little bit taller, and they get taller and taller and taller. Or even color of their hair. We might have very light hair, and so it gets darker as the continuum moves along. So that then doesn't put them into specific categories. Whereas if we have a look at discontinuous variation, it's those characteristics that place organisms into specific categories, like we see in blood groups. Another example would be birds of different colors, where you have green birds and blue birds and yellow birds. That would be an example of discontinuous variation where they are then placed in specific categories. Okay, so discontinuous variation then places organisms in distinct categories, as we can see here with the 4 different blood types that we find in human beings. Okay, and we've reached the end of our lesson for today, and we'll see you again next time.